September 14th, 1847, Charleston, South Carolina. In the suffocating humidity of a plantation manor where magnolias bloomed over unmarked graves, a woman named Eleanor Whitmore descended the servants' staircase wearing iron shackles on her wrists, not as punishment, not as theater, but as penance. The chains were cold against her pale skin, their weight a nightly ritual she had carried in secret for a decade. The house slaves watched through cracked doorways, their eyes wide with confusion and something darker, recognition. For they knew what the mistress did not yet understand, that guilt, when left to fester in silence, does not absolve. It devours. Eleanor Whitmore was the wife of a cotton magnate, a woman draped in silk and southern gentility, who smiled at church socials and recited scripture with the confidence of the righteous. But beneath the veneer of grace lived a truth so grotesque it would unravel her legacy entirely. For 10 years she had owned a woman named Celeste, a house slave whose intelligence and beauty had become both Eleanor's obsession and her curse. What began as cruelty had twisted into something far more sinister, a psychological bondage where Eleanor convinced herself that by wearing chains each night, she was somehow sharing Celeste's suffering, atoning for the sin of ownership. But the journal they found after Eleanor's death, hidden beneath floorboards in the western wing, revealed no atonement, only betrayal, only theft, only a decade of stolen freedom dressed as martyrdom. This is not a story of redemption. This is a story of how evil wears the mask of empathy, how oppression disguises itself as sacrifice, and how one woman's delusion became another woman's hell. The journal, written in Eleanor's meticulous hand, documented every night she wore those chains, and every morning she locked them away, returning to her life of comfort while Celeste remained bound by law, by lash, by a cruelty far heavier than iron. If you're ready to descend into the suffocating darkness of the antebellum South, to witness a reckoning 10 years in the making, then stay with us. Subscribe, bear witness. Because some stories are not told to comfort, they are told to ensure we never forget what monsters look like when they weep. The Whitmore estate sprawled across 200 acres of stolen land, its white columns rising like bones from the red Carolina clay. Oak trees older than the nation itself formed a canopy over the main road, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that swayed like the hair of drowned women. The mansion itself was a monument to wealth extracted from human suffering. 12 bedrooms, a grand ballroom with chandeliers shipped from Paris, and a library containing books Eleanor had never read but displayed with pride. Beneath this architecture of elegance lived 37 enslaved people, their quarters hidden behind a wall of hedges, so the Whitmores and their guests need never see the source of their fortune. Among them was Celeste, 26 years old, born on this very plantation to a mother who had died in childbirth, and a father sold south before she could form memories of his face. Celeste had been raised in the main house, taught to read by Eleanor's own mother, a woman who believed that educated slaves made better servants, never considering what education might do to a soul condemned to servitude. By the time Eleanor inherited Celeste at age 16, Celeste had already begun to understand the profound cruelty of her existence. She could read Voltaire but could not write her own name in any document that mattered. She could speak French but could not speak freely. She knew the world was vast, but her world was 12 rooms and a garden she tended under the gaze of men with rifles. Eleanor had watched Celeste grow from a silent child into a woman whose intelligence burned behind her eyes like a caged fire, and perhaps it was that fire, that undeniable proof that Celeste was not property but person, that first planted the seed of Eleanor's twisted ritual. The chains began the night after Eleanor's husband Thomas remarked at dinner that Celeste had a knowing look about her, almost human. Eleanor had smiled then, nodded, and excused herself. That night, in the darkness of her dressing room, she locked iron around her wrists and wept. She told herself it was empathy. It was not. It was the beginning of a performance that would consume them both. Eleanor remembered that first night with the clarity of a wound that never healed. She had retrieved the shackles from the plantation's punishment shed, a small building near the tobacco barns where disobedient slaves were disciplined, their screams absorbed by thick walls and the indifference of those who profited from their labor. The iron was old, rust-darkened, still carrying the sweat and blood of bodies long since worked to death or sold away. She had carried them to her bedroom wrapped in linen, as though concealing a shameful treasure, and waited until Thomas fell into his whiskey-soaked sleep before locking them around her wrists. The weight was immediate, oppressive. The metal bit into her skin, and she gasped at the discomfort, tears streaming down her face as she knelt beside her four-poster bed draped in imported silks. She stayed there for 1 hour, counting each minute on the grandfather clock in the hallway, before removing the chains and hiding them in a trunk beneath her winter coats. The next morning, she had descended to breakfast with raw, reddened wrists that she explained away as a rash from new soap. Celeste had been serving that morning, moving through the dining room with the invisible grace expected of her, pouring coffee and setting down plates of eggs and ham with hands that had known chains since childhood. Eleanor watched her, searched her face for some sign of shared suffering, some acknowledgement of the previous night's ritual. But Celeste's expression remained neutral, professionally blank, because she had learned long ago that showing emotion in the presence of white people was dangerous. Eleanor had felt something then, not connection, but disappointment. She wanted Celeste to know. She wanted recognition for her sacrifice, her willingness to suffer alongside the woman she owned. But she could not speak of it, not directly, not yet. So instead she wore the chains again the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. What began as a single act of performative guilt became a ritual, then an obsession, then a grotesque cornerstone of Eleanor's identity. She was, in her own mind, a martyr. In reality, she was something far worse. Eleanor began keeping the journal in October of 1837, 3 weeks after the ritual began. She purchased it from a stationer in Charleston during one of her monthly trips to the city, selecting a leather-bound volume with cream-colored pages and a lock that required a tiny brass key she wore on a chain around her neck. The first entry was dated October 19th, written in her elegant slanting script. "Tonight marks the 21st night I have worn the chains. My wrists ache, but my soul feels lighter. I am convinced that God sees my sacrifice, that He understands I am not like the others who own slaves without thought or conscience. I suffer with Celeste. I share her burden. Surely this must count for something in the eternal ledger." The delusion was complete from the very beginning. Eleanor never once questioned the fundamental obscenity of her logic, that wearing chains for an hour while lying in a feather bed, only to remove them and return to a life of absolute freedom, could in any way approximate the experience of a woman who would wear invisible chains until death. The journal entries continued with religious fervor, each one documenting the duration of her nightly bondage, the physical discomfort she endured, and the spiritual elevation she believed it granted her. By November, she had begun to write about Celeste directly, describing her movements, her rare smiles, the particular way she folded linens or arranged flowers. "She looked at me today with something like understanding," Eleanor wrote on November 8th. "I believe she senses what I do for her, even though I cannot speak of it. There is a connection between us now, forged in shared suffering." But there was no connection. Celeste had no knowledge of Eleanor's nightly theater. She knew only that her mistress had become increasingly strange, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, asking questions about her comfort and well-being that felt less like kindness and more like intrusion. Celeste had learned to navigate the moods of white people the way sailors navigate storms, with caution, silence, and the understanding that survival meant making yourself small, unremarkable, forgettable. She did not sense Eleanor's ritual. She sensed danger. Thomas Whitmore was a man who measured his worth in bales of cotton and the number of bodies he owned. At 43, he had inherited the plantation from his father and expanded it with ruthless efficiency, purchasing land from failing neighbors and slaves from auctions in Richmond and Savannah. He was not unusually cruel by the standards of his class and time. He did not personally wield the whip, did not rape the women under his control, did not separate families unless financially necessary. He simply regarded enslaved people as livestock with the inconvenient capability of speech, and he ran his plantation with the cold pragmatism of a man who had never questioned the system that elevated him. Eleanor existed in his world as an ornament, a symbol of his refinement and social standing. She was beautiful in the way Southern society demanded, pale, delicate, soft-spoken in public, and sufficiently educated to host dinners without embarrassing him. He had married her for her family's connections and her father's land, which had merged seamlessly with his own holdings. What she did with her time between social obligations and childbearing, they had lost 2 infants to fever and she had not conceived again, was of no concern to him as long as she maintained appearances. He never entered her bedroom unannounced. He never noticed the raw skin on her wrists. Or if he did, he attributed it to the mysterious frailties of women about which he preferred to remain ignorant. He never saw the journal she kept locked in her writing desk. He never observed the way she watched Celeste with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Thomas's blindness was not accidental. It was cultivated, a willful ignorance that allowed him to move through his life without the burden of examining it. He attended church every Sunday, sang hymns with genuine feeling, and believed himself to be a good Christian man. He provided for his wife, managed his property, paid his debts, and never once considered that the foundation of his entire existence was built on stolen lives and justified by a theology designed to comfort tyrants. In his world, Eleanor's strangeness was simply the eccentricity of a childless woman with too much time and too much sensibility. He would die never knowing the truth. Celeste moved through the Whitmore house like a ghost, learning to haunt in reverse, present but unseen, essential but unacknowledged, alive but legally dead. Her days began before dawn, when the Carolina sky was still bruised purple and the roosters had not yet announced the violence of another day. She would wake on her thin mattress in the quarters, dress in the plain gray cotton that marked her as house staff rather than field worker, and walk the dirt path to the kitchen building where Aunt Ruth, 60 years old and half blind from cataracts, had already started the fires. Together they would prepare breakfast for the Whitmores: eggs, ham, biscuits, coffee, strong enough to fuel Thomas through his morning inspections of the fields. Celeste would carry the trays into the main house through the back entrance, climb the servants' stairs, and arrange everything in the dining room before the master and mistress descended. She had learned to move silently, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to read the moods of white people in the set of their shoulders and the tightness around their mouths. This was survival. This was the education that mattered more than French or literature, the ability to become invisible while remaining indispensable. But lately something had shifted. Eleanor had begun watching her with an expression Celeste could not decipher. It was not lust. Celeste knew that look well enough from Thomas's overseer and the visiting men who thought enslaved women were included in the hospitality. It was not exactly hatred either, though hatred would have been easier to navigate. It was something stranger, a mixture of longing, guilt, and possessiveness that made Celeste's instincts scream danger even when Eleanor's words were soft. The mistress had started asking questions. "Are you happy, Celeste? Do you ever think about freedom? If you could go anywhere, where would it be?" These questions were traps, Celeste knew. There were no safe answers. To say she was happy would be a lie that insulted them both. To say she was not happy would be interpreted as ingratitude, possibly punished. To speak of freedom was to invite suspicion of rebellion. So Celeste had learned to answer in the language of slaves, indirect, deferential, designed to satisfy without revealing. "I am grateful for your kindness, ma'am. I think only of serving you well, ma'am. My place is here, ma'am." It was a February night in 1840, 3 years into the ritual, when Eleanor finally broke her silence. She had summoned Celeste to her bedroom under the pretense of needing help with the buttons on the back of her nightgown, a task Eleanor was perfectly capable of performing herself, but one that allowed her to manufacture intimacy, to have Celeste's hands on her body, to pretend for a moment that the distance between them was mere fabric rather than an abyss of power and violence. Celeste had climbed the main staircase, knocked softly on the bedroom door, and entered to find Eleanor standing by the window in her dressing gown, moonlight casting her shadow long across the Persian rug. "Close the door," Eleanor had whispered, and Celeste obeyed, her heart beginning to hammer because closed doors meant privacy and privacy meant danger. But Eleanor did not move toward her. Instead, she walked to her wardrobe, opened the bottom drawer, and retrieved something wrapped in black velvet. When she unwrapped it, Celeste saw the chains, iron shackles connected by a short length of links, their surface marked with rust and the unmistakable stains of old blood. "Do you know what these are?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling with an emotion Celeste could not name. Celeste nodded slowly. Every enslaved person knew what shackles were. They were the physical manifestation of their condition, the tools of transport and punishment, the weight that reduced human beings to cargo. "I wear them," Eleanor continued, tears forming in her pale eyes. "Every night, Celeste. For 3 years I have worn these chains for you, so that I might understand, so that I might share in your suffering." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was already spreading beyond control. Celeste stood frozen, her mind racing through possible responses, searching desperately for the reaction that would keep her safe. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity, to scream at the obscenity, to ask Eleanor if she truly believed that 1 hour of voluntary discomfort while lying in a room warmer and more luxurious than any space Celeste would ever inhabit could approximate a lifetime of bondage. But she said none of this. Instead, she lowered her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, ma'am," because that was all a slave could ever say. After that night, Eleanor's obsession metastasized into something more dangerous than secrecy. She began to demand Celeste's presence during the ritual itself, summoning her to the bedroom under various pretenses, mending, cleaning, organizing, but always timing it so that Celeste would witness Eleanor locking the chains around her wrists. She would kneel on the floor, tears streaming down her face, and look up at Celeste with an expression of desperate need, waiting for acknowledgement, for gratitude, for some sign that her performance was being received as the profound act of solidarity she believed it to be. Celeste learned to stand in the corner of the room, eyes downcast, face carefully blank, while her mistress performed this grotesque theater. Sometimes Eleanor would speak, her voice choked with emotion. "Do you see, Celeste? Do you understand what I sacrifice for you? I could be comfortable, but I choose to suffer. I choose to know your pain." And Celeste would nod, murmur agreement, play the role assigned to her because resistance was not survival. The journal entries from this period reveal Eleanor's complete descent into delusion. "Tonight Celeste wept when she saw me in chains," she wrote in March of 1840, though Celeste had done no such thing. "She understands now that we are bound together, not as mistress and slave, but as two souls connected by suffering. I believe she loves me for what I do." The reality was far darker. Celeste had begun to understand that Eleanor's ritual was not about empathy or atonement, it was about possession of a different kind. Eleanor was not trying to free her or even to ease her suffering. She was trying to colonize it, to claim Celeste's pain as her own, to transform the horror of enslavement into a narrative where Eleanor herself was the hero. It was a violence more insidious than the whip, because it dressed itself as love. In the quarters, Celeste began to have nightmares. She would wake gasping, her body drenched in sweat, haunted by visions of Eleanor's pale hands reaching for her, chains rattling like the bones of the dead. The other enslaved people noticed the change in her, the way she flinched at sudden movements, the way her hands trembled when she carried trays into the main house, but they could not help her. No one could. In the spring of 1843, Eleanor's sister Catherine arrived from Savannah for an extended visit. Catherine was younger by 4 years, unmarried, and possessed of a sharp intelligence that had made her unmarriageable by the standards of men who preferred their wives decorative and silent. She had always viewed Eleanor's marriage with a mixture of pity and relief, pity for the loneliness she sensed beneath her sister's practiced smiles, relief that she herself had escaped a similar fate. Catherine noticed immediately that something was wrong. Eleanor had grown gaunt, her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness, her wrists marked with bruises she explained away as clumsiness. She spoke of Celeste constantly, obsessively, in ways that made Catherine uncomfortable. "She's extraordinary, truly," Eleanor would say over afternoon tea. "So intelligent, so graceful. Sometimes I think she understands me better than anyone." Catherine watched the way Eleanor's gaze followed Celeste through rooms, the way she manufactured reasons to touch her, adjusting her collar, brushing lint from her sleeve, letting her fingers linger a moment too long, and she watched Celeste's response, the careful neutrality, the practiced deference, and underneath it all, the unmistakable tension of a trapped animal. One evening, Catherine confronted her sister in the garden, away from the house and the ears of servants. "Eleanor, what are you doing with that girl?" she asked bluntly. Eleanor's face flushed with color, her hands twisting in her lap. "I don't know what you mean." "You watch her like she's a lover or a prisoner. It's unseemly. People will talk." Eleanor stood abruptly, her voice rising with defensive anger. "You don't understand. I'm helping her. She stopped, seeming to catch herself. "I'm ensuring she's well cared for. Is that a crime?" Catherine studied her sister's face and saw something there that frightened her, a fervor that reminded her of the religious fanatics who occasionally swept through the South, preaching apocalypse and ecstasy in equal measure. "Whatever you're doing," Catherine said quietly, "it's not helping her. It's destroying you both." But Eleanor would not hear it. That night she wore the chains for 3 hours instead of 1 until her wrists bled and she collapsed on the floor, weeping. Celeste found her there in the morning, unconscious, still shackled, and said nothing. By 1845, the ritual had consumed Eleanor entirely. She no longer attended church socials or entertained guests. She spent her days in her room, writing in her journal, planning each night's performance with the meticulous attention of a priest preparing for communion. The entries had become increasingly unhinged, filled with religious imagery and declarations of mystical union. "Celeste and I are one soul split between two bodies," she wrote in July. "The chains bind us together across the false divisions of race and station. When I suffer, she is freed. When I bleed, she is cleansed. This is my purpose. This is my salvation." Thomas had grown concerned enough to consult a doctor who diagnosed his wife with female hysteria and prescribed bed rest, laudanum, and the removal of books that might overstimulate her delicate mind. But Eleanor continued, now adding laudanum-soaked visions to her nightly ritual, the drug amplifying her delusions into full-blown hallucinations. She would see Celeste kneeling beside her in chains, weeping with gratitude. She would hear voices telling her that her sacrifice would be remembered, that she was a martyr in the cause of a justice she could not name. Meanwhile, Celeste was disintegrating. The constant surveillance, the forced witnessing of Eleanor's breakdown, the impossible position of having to perform gratitude for a torment disguised as benevolence, it was breaking something fundamental inside her. She began to make mistakes, dropping dishes, forgetting instructions, speaking out of turn. The overseer noticed and recommended discipline. Thomas agreed. On an August morning, Celeste was taken to the punishment shed and whipped, 10 lashes for insolence and incompetence. Eleanor watched from her bedroom window, and when Celeste returned to the house hours later, her back striped with blood, Eleanor met her in the hallway. "I'm so sorry," Eleanor whispered, reaching for her. "Tonight I'll wear the chains for twice as long. I'll feel what you feel. Celeste pulled away, and for the first time in 10 years she looked Eleanor directly in the eyes. "You feel nothing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of a decade's rage. "You will never feel anything." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the hallway, chains hanging from her trembling hands. That night, Celeste did not sleep. She lay on her mattress in the quarters, staring at the ceiling beams while the other enslaved people breathed in exhausted rhythm around her. Her back burned where the whip had torn her flesh, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through her body. But it was not the physical agony that kept her awake. It was the sudden crystalline clarity that had settled over her mind like frost. She had spent 10 years surviving, 10 years performing the role of the grateful slave, 10 years. Watching Eleanor descend into a madness that fed on Celeste's forced participation, and in all that time she had believed survival meant silence, meant compliance, meant swallowing her rage until it became part of her bones. But Eleanor's words in the hallway, "I'll feel what you feel," had finally shattered that belief. Because Eleanor would never feel what Celeste felt. She would never know the terror of being property, of having no claim to her own body, of watching her mother die and knowing she could not even grieve properly because grief was time stolen from labor. She would never understand that the chains Celeste wore were not iron but law, not visible but absolute, not removable at dawn but permanent until death or the collapse of the world that had created them. And if Eleanor could not understand, then there was no point in pretending anymore, no point in gratitude performances, no point in protecting the delusion of a woman who had turned Celeste's suffering into her own spiritual theater. Celeste rose before dawn and walked to the kitchen where Aunt Ruth was already stoking the fires. The old woman looked up, saw something in Celeste's face, and nodded slowly. "You gonna run?" she said. It was not a question. Celeste shook her head. No. Running meant dogs, meant capture, meant death or sail further south where conditions were even worse. Running meant survival was still the goal, but Celeste no longer wanted to survive. She wanted something else entirely. "I'm going to make sure they remember," she said quietly. "Remember what?" Aunt Ruth asked, though she already knew. "Everything," Celeste answered. "Everything they did. Everything they are." Celeste spent the following weeks in careful observation, her silence now weaponized rather than defensive. She watched Eleanor's rituals with new eyes, noting every detail, every word spoken during the nightly performances. She memorized the location of the journal. Eleanor had grown careless, leaving it sometimes on her writing desk, the tiny brass key often tucked in the same jewelry box where she kept her pearls. Celeste began to understand that the journal was Eleanor's true confession, the record of a decade's delusion written in her own hand. It was proof. Not of Eleanor's sacrifice as she believed, but of her profound moral corruption, the evidence that she had transformed human suffering into personal mythology, that she had colonized even the pain of the woman she claimed to care for. In the quarters at night, Celeste spoke in whispers to those she trusted most, not about escape, not about rebellion in the traditional sense, but about memory, about testimony, about ensuring that when the reckoning came, and Celeste believed it would come, somehow, someday, there would be a record that could not be denied or rewritten. Old Aunt Ruth, who had seen 3 generations of Whitmores profit from stolen lives, understood immediately. So did Samuel, a field worker with scars on his back that formed a map of 20 years' punishment, and Dinah, who had been sold away from her children and carried that grief like stones in her chest. They began to document everything, the names of those who had died, the families torn apart, the casual cruelties and the spectacular violences, the profits extracted and the humanity denied. They had no paper, no ink, no literacy except for Celeste's dangerous education, but they had memory, and they passed it to each other like contraband, building an oral archive of atrocity that would survive even if they did not. Meanwhile, Eleanor's condition worsened. She wore the chains now for entire nights, waking with her wrists raw and infected. She stopped eating regularly. She spoke to herself in her room, conversations with a Celeste who existed only in her laudanum-addled mind, a Celeste who loved her, who thanked her, who understood. Thomas finally called for a specialist from Charleston, a doctor who dealt with cases of extreme nervous disorders in women. The appointment was set for September 15, 1847, but Eleanor would not live to keep it. Stop here for a moment. Breathe. What you are witnessing is not simply a historical curiosity or a tale designed to shock. This is a record of how power warps the mind, how oppression disguises itself in the language of care, how the enslaved were forced not only to endure bondage but to perform gratitude for their suffering. Eleanor's chains were theater, Celeste's chains were law. One could be removed, the other could not. If this story has gripped you, if it has made you uncomfortable in ways that matter, then subscribe. Share this. Comment below with the names of those whose stories have been erased, whose suffering was transformed into someone else's redemption narrative. Because the only way we honor the Celestes of history is by refusing to let their truth be buried beneath the delusions of those who oppress them. Bear witness, that is the least we can do. September 14th, 1847. The night before the doctor's arrival. Eleanor had spent the day in a state of manic preparation, convinced that she needed to demonstrate the purity of her ritual to the physician who would surely understand what Thomas could not, that her suffering was holy, that her chains were sacrament. She had instructed Celeste to prepare her bedroom as though for a ceremony, candles lit, windows draped, the chains polished until they gleamed in the flickering light. Celeste obeyed, moving through the preparations with the mechanical precision of someone who had already detached from her body, already made the calculations that would define what came next. At 11:47 p.m., Eleanor locked the shackles around her wrists and sank to her knees on the floor, her white nightgown pooling around her like a shroud. She looked up at Celeste with eyes glassy from laudanum and fever. "Kneel with me," she whispered. "Please, just once. Let us be equals in this suffering." It was the breaking point Celeste had been waiting for, the moment when Eleanor's delusion became so complete that she actually believed a slave could choose to kneel, could choose anything at all. Celeste looked at the woman who had owned her for 10 years, who had stolen even her pain and repackaged it as personal martyrdom, who had forced her to witness a nightly performance of false atonement while doing nothing, nothing to actually free her. And Celeste made her choice. She did not kneel. Instead, she walked to Eleanor's writing desk, retrieved the journal, and tucked it inside her dress. Eleanor, lost in her laudanum haze, did not notice. "The journal," Celeste said quietly, "is going to tell the truth. Not your truth, the real truth." Eleanor's eyes focused slowly, confusion spreading across her face. "What are you—" But Celeste was already moving toward the door. "You want to wear chains?" she said, her voice steady and cold. "Then wear them. But don't you ever pretend you know what they mean." She walked out of the room, closing the door behind her. Eleanor remained on her knees, shackled and alone, as the candles burned down to nothing and the night pressed in like a fist. Thomas found his wife at dawn. He had risen early to meet with his overseer about the cotton yield, and when Eleanor did not appear for breakfast, he sent a housegirl to check on her. The girl returned minutes later, her face pale with shock, unable to speak. Thomas climbed the stairs with irritation that curdled into dread as he approached Eleanor's bedroom door. Inside, he found her collapsed on the floor, still wearing the chains, her wrists torn and bleeding where she had struggled against the iron throughout the night. Her eyes were open but unseeing, her lips blue, her body cold. The doctor would later determine that her heart had given out, weakened by months of laudanum abuse, malnutrition, and the physical strain of her nightly rituals. But Thomas, standing in that room surrounded by candles burned to stubs and the metallic smell of blood, understood that his wife had died of something more complex than heart failure. She had died of a madness he had willfully ignored, a deterioration he had allowed because acknowledging it would have required him to examine the foundation of their entire lives. He unlocked the shackles with shaking hands, letting them fall to the floor with a sound like judgment. And then he saw that Eleanor's writing desk had been disturbed, the small drawer left open, the contents rifled through. The journal was gone. Thomas's first instinct was rage. Some slave had stolen from his dead wife, had violated the sanctity of her private space. He stormed downstairs, shouting for the overseer, demanding that every enslaved person on the plantation be questioned, searched, punished if necessary. But when they gathered the house slaves in the main hall, Celeste was not among them. She had disappeared sometime in the night, taking nothing but the clothes on her back and a leather-bound journal that Thomas had never known existed. The overseer organized a search party immediately, Dogs, horses, men with rifles who knew the swamps and backroads where runaways typically fled. But they found no trace of her. It was as though Celeste had simply dissolved into the Carolina darkness, becoming smoke, becoming memory, becoming something that could not be captured or killed. Celeste had not run to the swamps or taken the routes that captured runaways typically traveled. She had walked instead to the small Baptist church 3 miles north, a church where free black people and sympathetic Quakers sometimes gathered in the early morning hours before the slave patrols began their rounds. She arrived as the sun broke the horizon, her body exhausted but her mind sharp with purpose. In her arms she carried Eleanor's journal. The minister, a free black man named Reverend Joshua Hayes, opened the door and saw immediately what Celeste was, a fugitive with hours at best before the dogs came. But he also saw what she carried, not supplies for escape, not stolen goods, but a book bound in leather with a brass lock she had broken open with a kitchen knife. "This is evidence," Celeste told him, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Evidence of what they are, what they do, not just the beatings and the sales. Everyone knows about those. This is proof of how they make us complicit in their delusions, how they steal even our suffering and call it their own." Reverend Hayes took the journal and read the first few pages. His face hardened as he absorbed Eleanor's words, the self-congratulatory accounts of her nightly chains, the descriptions of Celeste's supposed gratitude, the twisted theology that transformed ownership into sacrifice. "This needs to reach the abolitionists," he said quietly. "The ones up north who publish narratives. This is—" He paused, searching for words adequate to the obscenity documented in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. "This is evidence of a sickness in the soul." He gave Celeste what little money the church had, instructions to a safe house 20 miles northeast, and a promise. He would copy the journal's most damning entries before sending the original north to Frederick Douglass himself, to William Lloyd Garrison, to anyone who could ensure these words would be read, discussed, weaponized against the institution that had created them. Celeste left as the morning light strengthened, knowing the dogs would come soon, knowing she might not survive the week, but the journal would survive, the truth would survive, and that finally was enough. The dogs found Celeste's trail 3 days later, tracking her to a barn 15 miles from the Whitmore plantation where she had hidden in the hayloft, her body weak from lack of food and the infection that had set into the whip wounds on her back. The slave catchers, 4 men who made their living hunting human beings, dragged her down from the loft and shackled her with the same casual efficiency they would use on any valuable livestock that had strayed from its owner. But Celeste did not fight them. She did not beg or weep or perform any of the expected responses that might have earned her a marginally less brutal return. Instead, she smiled. It was a smile that unnerved the men, a smile that suggested she knew something they did not, that she had already won a victory they could not comprehend. They brought her back to Thomas Whitmore in chains, real chains, not Eleanor's theatrical props, and he stood on the steps of his plantation house looking at the woman who had fled and wondering what exactly he was supposed to do with her now. His wife was dead, the journal was gone, its contents already being copied and distributed through the networks of abolitionists and free black communities in ways Thomas could not stop or even fully understand. And Celeste, standing before him in irons, still wore that smile. "You took something that belonged to my wife," Thomas said, his voice tight with rage and confusion. "A journal. Where is it?" Celeste met his eyes. Another transgression, another refusal to perform the expected deference. "It's where it belongs," she said, "with people who will make sure everyone knows what she was, what you are." Thomas struck her then, a backhanded blow that split her lip and sent her to her knees. But even kneeling, even bleeding, Celeste did not lower her gaze. The overseer recommended she be sold south as punishment, sent to the sugar plantations of Louisiana where the life expectancy of slaves was measured in years rather than decades. Thomas agreed. Celeste was sold 3 days later for $800 to a trader heading to New Orleans. She would die within 2 years, worked to death in the cane fields. but her name would live longer than the Whitmore fortune. Eleanor's journal reached Frederick Douglass in October of 1847. He published excerpts in the North Star with a commentary so scathing it became one of the most widely circulated abolitionist texts of the decade. Here, Douglass wrote, we see the final perversion of the slaveholding mind, a woman who believes that by wearing chains for an hour in comfort, she absolves herself of the sin of owning another human being entirely. This is not empathy. This is the ultimate theft, the colonization of suffering itself, the transformation of a slave's reality into a slaveholder's spiritual theater. The journal became evidence, ammunition, a document so grotesque in its self-delusion that even some moderate Southerners found themselves unable to defend it. The Whitmore name became synonymous with a particular kind of moral bankruptcy, not the honest brutality of the overseer's whip, but the insidious cruelty of those who dress their violence in the language of love and call their oppression sacrifice. Thomas died in 1856, his fortune diminished, his reputation destroyed, his plantation slowly failing as the enslaved people he owned engaged in increasingly bold acts of resistance and escape. The Civil War came, and the Whitmore estate burned in 1865, reduced to ashes and the whispered memories of those who had survived it. But Celeste's story endured. It was passed down through generations, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a testimony of resistance, of a woman who refused to allow her suffering to be stolen and rewritten, who ensured that the truth would outlive both her enslaver and herself. In the quarters and churches and small gatherings where Black people spoke their own histories, Celeste became legend. The woman who took the chains meant to bind her and turn them into evidence. The woman who smiled in captivity because she knew the master's words would condemn them more thoroughly than any rebellion. This is not a story of redemption. This is a story of reckoning. Eleanor wore chains and called it sacrifice. Celeste bore chains and called it what it was, slavery. One legacy died with its delusions. The other was written in truth, in memory, in the unstoppable current of justice that bends slowly but breaks everything false in its path. Remember her name. Remember what they did. Remember that some chains can never be justified, no matter how beautifully the captors dress their violence in the language of care.